Hey guys, welcome to AP Environmental Science with Mr. Jones. Today we're going to go over the second part of our biogeochemistry lecture on nitrogen and phosphorus cycles. So the things that you need to know at the end of all of these biogeochemical cycles is the sources and sinks for each of those elements, and the importance of each one of those elements to living things. So let's start with the nitrogen cycle. So nitrogen makes up about 78% of the Earth's atmosphere by mass, making it like the sixth most abundant element on Earth. It is essential for DNA and RNA and is necessary for plant growth. Unfortunately, even though it is so chemically abundant, it's inert in the atmosphere, so it has to be transformed or fixed by bacteria in order to be used by plants and then move up the food chain into consumers. Because it has to be fixed, it's actually often a limiting resource in both the lithosphere and the hydrosphere. So this is a pretty simple diagram showing the different parts of the nitrogen cycle. So nitrogen in the atmosphere is fixed by nitrogen-fixing bacteria, and those can either exist alone in the soil or in a symbiotic mutualistic relationship with legumes. And that benefits both species. The bacteria are given a place to live and often receive sugars from the plant through photosynthesis. And the plant has a ready source of nitrogen because it houses those nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Once it's fixed, it becomes ammonium, which still can't be used directly. So nitrifying bacteria transform that ammonium to nitrites and ultimately nitrates, which can be assimilated by plants or used by plants. Once it's in those plants, animals and fungi consume those plants, and that's how they gain any of their nitrogen. It also can be returned to the atmosphere. Nitrogen can be returned to the atmosphere by denitrifying bacteria. So the nitrifying bacteria bring the nitrogen into a usable form from the atmosphere, and denitrifying bacteria transform it back into nitrogen gas, or N2, in its inert form in the atmosphere. We can look at a much more complex figure showing the nitrogen cycle, really looking at the sources and sinks of nitrogen. So again, the atmosphere is the major source, but it's still inert. We have figured out a way to skip the whole bacterial process and make nitrogen available directly to plants from atmospheric nitrogen. And we do that a lot, and that's how we get the majority of the fertilizer that we use, especially in the big industrial scale farms. A lot of that nitrogen runs off into waterways and ultimately will cause eutrophication in those waterways, but we'll talk about that more at the end of this presentation. Now let's look at the phosphorus cycle. So phosphorus is a key component of cell membranes, think the phospholipid bilayer, and it's also a really important part of ATP, which is our energy currency. And so phosphorus is super, super important to life. Unlike carbon and nitrogen, there's really no meaningful amount of phosphorus in the atmosphere. It mostly exists in rocks and soils and as ions in the water that are brought with water from runoff. So plants take that up either directly from the soil in the case of terrestrial plants, or as ions from the water in the case of algae or aquatic plants. And animals and other consumers get it from those plants. So we look at the phosphorus cycle. Again, the majority of phosphorus is coming from, or all of phosphorus is ultimately coming from rocks. So runoff, weathering, erosion allows that phosphorus to enter the hydrosphere as phosphorus ions, or phosphate ions. We mine phosphorus to use as fertilizer. and have, as a result, dramatically increased the amount of phosphorus that enters ecosystems. So if we think about that, if we start to think about those human impacts, we can think about eutrophication that I mentioned earlier. So water that is running over terrestrial environments, especially farmland, because we disturb all that soil, so there's not a dense covering of plants to hold those nutrients in that water. It allows for greater runoff, as well as runoff in cities and coming through wastewater treatment centers. Bring additional phosphorus and nitrogen into the aquatic ecosystems. That big influx of what is a limiting nutrient in most of these systems allows these big blooms of phytoplankton, which typically happen at the surface of the water because that's where the sunlight can penetrate. So you get these big algal blooms, which initially would provide an abundance of oxygen, but when those phytoplankton die, they sink to the bottom and are broken down by bacteria, which respire, which use oxygen and create carbon dioxide. That big bloom of bacteria ultimately reduces the oxygen in the water, and all the organisms at the bottom, if they can't move to a different area, will ultimately suffocate in hypoxic or very oxygen-poor water. So where do these nutrients come from? Again, the vast majority of them are going to come from agriculture. So corn and soybeans makes up a huge proportion of the nutrients that are, and its nutrient pollution really, entering the Gulf of Mexico. There are other sources, so pasture and rangeland, and we would expect to see a lot of phosphorus coming off of those because, again, it's being weathered out of the soil. Urban areas contribute to some degree, and that's largely through the sewage and wastewater. And then there's also natural contributions to the system. Again, these systems occur without humans, but we ultimately add, you can see 80% of nitrogen is coming from human sources, and 92% of phosphorus is coming from human sources. So again, what does that mean? This nutrient pollution allows for blooms of algae, including dinoflagellates, which cause red tides. Red tides, these dinoflagellates have a toxic component to them, so they can kill fish, they can kill other marine life, and if we consume those marine life, they can poison humans as well. The Gulf of Mexico is a really good example for us of a dead zone, and that the dead zone here is indicated in red. It's the mouth of the Mississippi River. The size of this dead zone is the size of New Hampshire, or even larger than New Hampshire. So for the idea of scale, that's a huge landmass that is hypoxic, and it makes it really difficult for the organisms that would live in that zone to survive. When we look at where are those nutrients coming from, really from the Mississippi River and the Mississippi River watershed, which incorporates the breadbasket of the United States. There's a huge amount of land encompassed in the Mississippi River watershed, where a lot of corn and soybeans are grown, and that's where the majority, as you saw in the previous slide, the majority of the nutrient runoff is coming from corn and soybean fields. The people who are affected by this most are the fishermen in the Gulf of Mexico. This is a shrimper. The tourism industry suffers too. All that fresh seafood is a big draw to these coastal communities. A lot of swimming, diving, and other water-related activities. But when you have these algal blooms, fish kills, it becomes a much less attractive place to go visit. When we really think about who is the most vulnerable with the greatest impact, though, it's going to be the subsistence fishing communities. So these are communities that may not have the ability to pack up their business and just do something else, right? Their entire livelihood and lives are dependent on the fisheries that are in these coastal communities. So if we look back at this Mississippi watershed, right, half of the country is contributing to negative impacts on this tiny fraction on the coastline of this hypoxic zone. So vulnerable communities there that don't have the ability to pick up and leave are definitely the most impacted.